turn on my mic. All right, I have one of these fancy lapel mics. My first time wearing one of these, I always wanted to try one of these out. And I get the thumbs up from AGP, so that means we are live. And thank you all so much for being here, taking time out of your evening to participate in this public information session. I'm always excited to see so many people who are interested in learning about planning and zoning and permit processes. And I acknowledge that that's only kind of one part of a much kind of bigger story of the current situation with Morro Elementary, but I think it's also a really important part, and it's the part that is really mostly within my purview. I'm Erlen Singwald. I'm the Community Development Director for City of Morro Bay, and really the focus of the discussion this evening is what is the city's vision for the future of Morro Elementary as encapsulated in the city's planning and zoning documents. So I'm a strong believer in the more the public and community is informed about the permitting process and our planning documents, the more you can engage in the process and more effective you can be, and the better outcomes we'll have in the planning process. And so I'm viewing this as real opportunity, again, to help inform the community about what is in our planning documents related to Morro Elementary and what the process might look like going forward at some point in the future if there is a development proposal on the site, or for you to have the information to help the community meet objectives for conservation or other types of uses related to Morro Elementary. Now, a big purpose of the presentation tonight is on the city's planning and zoning documents and how they apply to Morro Elementary. And it's really difficult to describe planning and zoning information without using some numbers for, density and units and setbacks and height. And once you start to hear those numbers, it makes you think about development. But I want to be really clear, we're only using numbers to help you understand what the rules in the city code are for development. There's no development proposal on the horizon at all. Again, it's just to help the community really understand what the planning documents say about Morro Elementary, to help you understand what the city's official planning vision is for the site. So again, welcome. And purpose of the meeting is focused on planning and zoning requirements and processes for Morro Elementary. Recently, given the district's decision to start the surplus process, there's been a lot of community interest about the property. There has been quite a bit of public comment at the city council. And in line with council goals, which encourage public engagement and public participation, we were directed by the council to host this public information session about the city's planning and zoning vision for the property. I have a real brief slide on historic background. I'm sure a lot of people in this room could lecture me on the history of Morro Elementary, but just to kind of set the stage and context for the discussion. Then again, general plan and vision, and what is a general plan? I've been a planner about 25 years, so it's something that I kind of take for granted. I just understand it, but I really want to take a moment to explain to you all what a general plan is and what it means in Morro Bay, and particularly for this property, and what are some of the requirements that it's really important for the public to understand. And of course, the zoning code requirements, and that's where we get into the kind of numerical development standards of height and density and unit count and minimum open space requirements. Then the permit process, as I'm going to get into later in the presentation, any development of Morro Elementary school site would require discretionary land use permit that is issued at the city's discretion. The thing about a discretionary land use permit is it's never guaranteed. It could be approved, it could be denied, it could be approved with modifications, and the decision-making process along the way, it builds in many opportunities for continuous public engagement, and particularly for a property as important as Morro Elementary, I think the city would go above and beyond in community engagement for decision-making on land use with that property. And then, last bullet here, CEQA. Some of you, I know, are very familiar with CEQA. Others, I'm sure, less so. It means California Environmental Quality Act. In the world that I live, in land use planning, CEQA probably takes up about 30% of our time. So every project we process we have to do a CEQA determination, and that is a very extensive process. It's also a very transparent process. The whole purpose of CEQA is to allow for public engagement to evaluate environmental impacts, and for the city as lead agency, that's the term in CEQA, lead agency, to disclose to the public what the environmental consequences might be if they approve a project. So I'll go into more detail on that with some specifics that relate to Morro Elementary. So, breathe. So here's the site location. I'm sure everyone in the room is very familiar with the location of Morro Elementary. I'm sure many of you have had a chance to walk through the building. I had that opportunity about a couple months ago. Beautiful building. But I still wanted to have this aerial photograph here in the presentation just to really, I think, reflect on and see what an important location this is in the city limits. I mean, I work every day at the city hall, just half a block, basically right across the street. You have community center and senior center right next door, walking distance to Albertsons, very short walk to the downtown. You know all of this already, but just from a planning standpoint, it is worthwhile to take a moment and just reflect what an incredible site and an incredible location this property is. 10 acres, right next to downtown Morro Bay. And of course, we all know on the left, the schoolhouse building built in 1936, and the big green square there is very important sports fields for the community. Almost the town green in some ways. We have the city park there on the right, but not a lot of large open sports fields. So, as planning staff, we recognize the importance to the community of those sports fields, and of course, any future land use planning or permitting with the property, that's going to be a major focus of discussion with the community. And historic background, we got all this information from the Historical Society's website, built in 1936, remodeled in 1956, and in the subsequent decades through about 1990, I understand, there were various classrooms added and remodels, and then Morro Elementary closed in 2001 due to a drop in enrollment and revenue in population. And we do have school district representatives here who I'm sure can go into a lot more detail on that history, but high level kind of set the context for the discussion this evening. And of course, Morro Elementary is very important to Morro Bay's history and present and future. Existing uses and development. So the site currently has the 1936 schoolhouse building on it. There's a sports field, and also there's Family Partnership Charter School located on the property. So there is an existing use on the site. Again, important context for the discussion. Now, general plan, this is the part that I get excited talking about. So under California law, all cities and counties are required to have a comprehensive plan that establishes the vision for all land use and development within that jurisdiction. And under state law, there's 7 mandatory elements that have to be included in the general plan. It's land use, circulation, housing, conservation, and open space. Those are separate mandatory elements, but they're often combined into one. Noise and safety. Some of the important things to know about the general plan is that all development in the city has to be consistent with the general plan. The general plan has policy, so you're not going to have necessarily setbacks or height or density standards. It's more higher level designations of land uses and policies that talk about the importance of preserving historic resources or the importance of preserving sensitive environmental resources, but not those actual numerical standards. It's more big picture vision for how we want to develop as a community. And oftentimes, the general plan will have tension between policies because there's these socioeconomic needs for growth and development, but there's also needs to preserve environmental resources, needs to protect public safety. So there's this tension between development and community character, preservation, and environmental protection, and the general plan has to balance all of that tension with a overall comprehensive vision for how we want to grow. Also, what's really unique, not really unique, but in Morro Bay, in addition to the general plan, we're also within the coastal zone. So there's another layer of regulations. Coastal Act, enacted in, I think, 1976, requires all development to receive a coastal development permit. The Coastal Commission has effectively deputized the city to issue coastal development permits because we have prepared our own local coastal program, which is our city's version of the Coastal Act. And just like the general plan, any development must be consistent with a local coastal program and requires a coastal development permit to be issued by the city. And that's one of those discretionary permits where the city has a lot of broad authority to approve or deny or approve a project with conditions of approval. And again, that discretionary process involves many opportunities for public participation and involvement. So going into a few of the general plan elements and information that particularly, I think, relate to this discussion, of course, land use. Well, from a technical legal standpoint, all of the elements of a general plan have equal legal standing, so one element doesn't supersede another. In reality, the land use element is really the heart or the core of the general plan because it establishes the allowed land uses, and that's very critical to a vision for growth and development. So what is the land use designation for Morro Elementary? It is residential high density. And the general plan specifies for this designation that is meant for high-density residential development. So apartments, condos, maybe duplexes, other attached units, triplexes, fourplexes. Now, what's really important to understand, though, is this doesn't mean that the existing uses there aren't allowed. So this is future vision for redevelopment of the site. If a future developer chooses to purchase the property and redevelop the property, then the general plan envisions it to be primarily high-density residential. But there's no requirement for it to be redeveloped, and the existing uses on the site now are actually allowable and consistent with the residential high-density land use designation. So that's important distinction there. And then housing. The housing element is probably I think, the element of the general plan that probably receives the most discussion and attention in the media, often in public meetings, and that's because it's the only element of the general plan that has to be updated periodically. So right now, San Luis Obispo County and the 7 cities are in an 8-year housing element cycle. So our current housing element cycle is 2020 through 2028. So it's required to be updated every 8 years, and it has to be approved by the State Housing and Community Development Department. So only the housing element has that requirement. And the purpose of the housing element, really, it's a roadmap that the city needs to prepare, showing the state how we are going to be able to meet our share of regional housing needs at all income and affordability levels. And so in the current housing element cycle, so from 2020 to 2028, I believe Morro Bay's regional housing needs target is 390 units. And as we updated the housing element back in 2020, we had to essentially prepare a spreadsheet or an inventory identifying all of the vacant sites in the city. They have to be vacant, and they have to be zoned for residential development, and we have to show that we have enough of that land in order to meet that number of 390 units to be built over that 10-year period. So Morro Elementary actually is not on that list. So it's not identified in our what's called the Regional Housing Needs Vacant Land Site Inventory. It most likely wasn't included. I wasn't at the city when the housing element was updated, but it most likely wasn't included because it's not vacant. It's actually developed with existing development. There's an existing use there. So it didn't meet the state's criteria as vacant. But it is 10 acres, centrally located next to services and jobs, and zoned for residential high density. So the housing element couldn't ignore that fact, and it did recognize in this language here of the housing element that in addition to that spreadsheet of all of the sites that meet our 390 units, Morro Elementary is also a site that provides additional opportunity for housing and affordable housing within Morro Bay. Conservation, another required element of the general plan. Of course, the Morro Elementary School building built in 1936 is a very important resource to the community. It's been a big part of the discussion, I understand, about the future of Morro Elementary and whether or not it is a historic structure. So remember when I mentioned before that all development has to be consistent with all of the policies of the general plan? That includes this policy here, C-2.3, which says protection of cultural resources, ensure the protection of historic, cultural, and archaeological resources during development, construction, and similar activities. Development shall avoid, to the maximum extent feasible, adversely impacting historic resources, et cetera, et cetera. So currently, we don't have the data to show that the schoolhouse building is indeed an official historic resource. But if we were to receive at any point in time a development application to develop Morro Elementary, remember it's a discretionary permit, it's subject to the California Environmental Quality Act. We're going to have to prepare a lot of information. There's going to be thousands of pages of technical reports and studies that we need to analyze for that environmental determination. And one of those reports that we would ask a developer to provide is a historic resource evaluation. And that will be prepared by an architectural historian. And they would determine, in their expert opinion, and the city would probably hire another architectural historian who represents the city to peer review that report to determine whether or not the schoolhouse meets the definition of a historic resource. And if it does, in order for the city to approve a project and find it consistent with this policy of the general plan, it would have to preserve that building. But I want to be clear, we don't have that information yet, and I will in a couple slides show the actual criteria that the architectural historian would have to consider in making that decision. But first, just quickly, I want to talk about zoning. So there's general plan, it's the high level policy information, how do we want to grow as a community over the next 25, 30 years. And then kind of bringing it down to the next level, we have zoning, which think numbers, objective standards, density, setbacks, height, lot coverage, minimum open area requirements. These are the types of standards that really begin to define the spatial relationships and bulk and scale and intensity of development on a specific parcel. And of course, any project has to comply with all the zoning standards. The site is zoned residential high density, consistent with the general plan land use designation for the property, and also consistent with the general plan land use designation for the property. Schools, daycare centers, parks, community facilities, those are allowable in the residential high density zoning district. So future development would be envisioned to be high density residential development primarily, but the existing development is allowable and the existing uses are allowable under this high density zoning for the site. And this is just an example here of the key zoning standards that apply to the property. Something that is really worth focusing on this slide is minimum density. So not all jurisdictions have minimum density in their zoning codes. It's more of a newer, I would say, innovative concept to encourage housing development and to make sure that residential parcels aren't underutilized from their potential. And our zoning code is quite recent. It was updated just in March of last year. And for the residential high density zoning district, there is a 15.1 unit per acre minimum density. That means that any proposed residential development project, if it were proposed on the entire 10-acre site, it would have to provide a minimum of 151 units. So if a developer came in and proposed 75 units, we'd say, sorry, that doesn't meet the zoning, you need at least 151 units, to a maximum ceiling of 27 units an acre, or 270 units. There's also an inclusionary housing requirement, and I know a lot of past conversations about Morro Elementary have touched on affordable housing and opportunities for this property to provide workforce housing, again, close proximity to services and jobs in the nearby downtown. So the zoning code has a minimum inclusionary housing requirement of 10%. So a developer would have to provide, let's say, if it's 151 unit development, you'd have to provide 15 affordable units, 10%. And inclusionary means basically the same thing as affordable. Now that doesn't preclude the potential for a future partnership between a nonprofit and a private developer to provide, deed restricted affordable housing well beyond 10% of the units, along with other market rate housing units. In my previous role working for the county, I was involved in a couple of projects in Napomo that were, I think, pretty successful partnerships between nonprofit affordable housing developers and for-profit developers, where they were able to work together and kind of leverage their resources to be able to produce projects that have a wide range of different affordability levels, from lower income and very low income apartments all the way to starter homes and higher, more expensive homes. And so that is a potential concept. And I think the main point, though, is an affordable housing project could provide more than 10% of the units at affordable. Development project could provide more than 10% of the units at affordable prices, but 10% is the minimum. And of course, I'm not going to go into details on all of these, but 60% lot coverage, 30% max building height, setbacks, on-site parking. This slide, so when working with my team to put this presentation together, we're thinking, how can we convey these zoning standards and different possible land uses and elements that go into a development project graphically without actually putting lines on a site plan, because again, there's no development project proposed. We don't want to create any type of perception that there is a development project proposed. So I thought this was a useful way just to visualize how zoning standards could translate down into kind of spatial relationships between different elements and different proportions of land use areas in a development project. So you can see here that, of course, the main hexagon housing, minimum 151 units, and then inside that, at least 15 of those units would have to be affordable, but you also have to have space to meet parking requirements. With development, you need infrastructure, roads, sidewalks, areas for drainage. And then you see on the top left there, supportive uses. So just like I was explaining how the existing use of the charter school is allowable in high density residential, there are other supportive commercial service type uses that are also allowable for residential high density and a mixed use type development, and there'll be opportunities to establish those types of uses as well as residential, and then of course open space as well. Now, permitting process. So I talked quite a bit about this earlier, and this slide just goes into a little more detail explaining how with a discretionary land use permit, there will be opportunities. If we get an application at some point in the future, there would be opportunities for public participation in every stage of the process. And I know this looks a little technical. I try to simplify it as much as possible. I am going to spend some time on it because I think it's really important information to understand. So first, application review. Let's say developer submitted an application to the community development department. As staff, we would start to review the application. There would most likely be, again, thousands of pages of technical studies that could be required. So geotechnical investigations, historic resource evaluation, possibly a cultural resource evaluation, considering archaeological resources, maybe a noise study, a traffic study. So a massive amount of data and information would be required with that application. And because there would be so much public interest about this site and theoretical project, the city would post all that information on our website, and that would be available. Just about any application that's any information included in a development application is public record, and we make it available to the public. The only exception is sort of trivia. The only exception is archaeological information under state law. That's confidential, and we can't share that. But everything else is very transparent, publicly available. So there's opportunity for the public to engage and look at that initial application submittal. And then we get into the environmental analysis. Remember, CEQA. That's a very extensive analysis looking at, I think, 17 different environmental issue areas that we have to synthesize and analyze the impacts, disclose the impacts to the public, and if any of the impacts are found to be significant, then we have to identify mitigation measures to reduce those impacts to less than significant levels. And then an environmental document will be published, and there'll be either a 30 or 45 or sometimes longer day public review period for the public to comment on that environmental document. And then staff would have to prepare responses and provide all that information to the decision makers to make a decision. And really the purpose of CEQA is to make sure that when, say, a planning commission or city council is voting on a project, they understand the environmental consequences of their decision, and that we are being transparent with the public, and the public understands all of the potential impacts of that project. And then, of course, at a planning commission meeting, there's opportunity for public comment during the public hearing. Also for a project, a theoretical project at Morro Elementary, city staff would certainly go above and beyond. This is sort of the minimum land use permit process, but I would imagine public workshops, a lot of community engagement throughout the whole process. And one of takeaways is the public and the city would have a lot of influence over the ultimate land use plan or development of Morro Elementary, because the city is the land use authority and the coastal permitting authority. And then the planning commission's decision is appealable to the city council by the public, and the council would make the final decision. And again, I think I've emphasized this enough, but there's no project, but just again, the more you understand this process, if a project were to come forward, or even if a project doesn't come forward, the more you understand this process, the more you can be effective as community members. And then just quickly, so I talked about this quite a bit already as far as the schoolhouse building and whether or not it's actually a historic resource. So I mentioned when we do that CEQA review, and there's the 17 different environmental issue areas, one of them is cultural resources, which considers impacts to historic resources. And a real important point is, it's actually, I think, right here in the regs, even if a potential historic resource is not listed on a local, state, or federal registry as a historic resource, the lead agency can still determine that it's a significant historic resource if there's a historic resource evaluation that reaches that conclusion. And this is the criteria. So under CEQA, for a historic resource to be considered significant, it has to meet one of these criteria. And the questions that the architectural historian will need to answer are, A, is this building associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of California's history and cultural heritage? Or is it associated with the lives of persons important in our past? Or does it embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, region, or method of construction, et cetera, et cetera? Or has yielded or may be likely to yield information important to prehistory or history? So this is the criteria for listing on the California Register of Historical Resources. So even if it's not on that list, if it meets the definition, if it meets this criteria, then the city would need to consider it a significant resource in the environmental determination. So, to conclude, key takeaways, I think it's really important to be clear on kind of roles and responsibilities. So San Luis Coastal School District is the owner of the property. We know they are following the surplus process to list the property, which is a big reason for why we're here learning about planning and zoning affecting the property. City of Morro Bay is the land use and permitting authority, which means the city, and really kind of by extension, the public through that discretionary permit process has a lot of influence on the land uses of the property through CEQA, through coastal permitting requirements, through a general plan, through the discretionary process. And then kind of summarize some of those points about the planning and zoning requirements. So again, no development proposed at this time. The city's required to process a development application. Let me clarify what I mean by that. So if a developer were to propose a project, city staff is required to collect all the information, do that environmental review, and take it forward to the council for a decision. We're required under state law to process a project if one is submitted. Again, I mentioned this many times, development would require a discretionary permit, which involves public participation in every stage of the process, is zoned for a minimum of 151 units, recognized in the general plan as a possible opportunity site for affordable housing, and we don't know the official historic status of the schoolhouse building, but if it is determined to be a significant historic resource, there are tools available with CEQA and our general plan to protect that resource. I know that was a lot of pretty dense content, so thank you for bearing with me. And that concludes my presentation this evening. And I'm available for questions. Of course, you can tell from my presentation, my focus really is general plan, zoning, land use information, but I'll do my best to answer any questions you have.
And since we're a full-service city, just raise your hand and I will scamper over to you for your question.
Yeah, Whitney here.
My question is, the property and the field there that is the Morro Elementary playground was always had 2 baseball diamonds on it during my kids' day and my day, and women's softball played there, and we had 6 little league teams and soccer teams and everything else that played on that field. Is there any much consideration of turning it into a park, which is what this end of town needs, is a park big enough to play a game on?
So, great question, and I'll answer it from the planning and zoning lens, which is a park is allowed there. So that would be an allowable use by our zoning code and our general plan. So if a community group were able to acquire the property, or some nonprofit were able to acquire the property, if there was any organization who acquired the property and they decided, hey, we want this to be a park, that would be allowed by the planning documents. That's the planner's answer. Yeah.
Two things. Just off the top of my head, I think this school actually easily qualifies as the historic property that you mentioned. And the second was, I personally would really appreciate it if I could get a hard copy of your presentation to
We'll post this on the website and send a link out if that works. Or you want a hard copy, if you want to pick up a hard copy from our community development department, 995 Shasta, we can print one out for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have any extra copies here tonight. But.
And going forward, are we going to have further meetings to discuss this, or how are we going to arrive at that? And what is the category that you labeled confidential? Was it architectural? Archaeological.
Yeah, cultural resources, so people don't go out hunting for artifacts.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course.
What would, on your map that had the
The hexagons?
what is the public or the supportive properties? Is that commercial? Wasn't that for a left
Yeah, so
corner that was
again,
significantly
This
sized?
is all very general and abstract. So what I was trying to convey is that there are other types of uses that may support, residential development, like a daycare or pocket parks, or certain types of maybe retail service land uses. Those are also allowable, and those could show up in some future land use plan for the property.
Thank you. I have a question regarding, I believe you said it was about a 10-acre lot. If a community group were able to come together and raise the money and buy it, is it possible to be able to subdivide it, let's say, cut off, let's say, a few acres, and be able to sell that for this high-density housing, and then potentially rezone the existing, the remaining property? Is that something that could potentially happen?
So yes, the short answer is yes. So it could be subdivided, it could be rezoned. Of course, there's processes for both of those. For a subdivision, there is a process. Also, there's, under the Subdivision Map Act, what's called a public lot, which is a little bit more of a streamlined process if the subdivision is to create a lot that will provide some type of public purpose, and if it's a city-owned lot. So that would be kind of an expedited type of subdivision process that could be possible in some hypothetical future scenario. And there's a process for rezoning as well.
Hi, Erilyn.
Judy.
Thank you for the well-done presentation. It was very informative. I have a couple of questions. So you mentioned 391 units. Are we mandated to have that many?
That's a great question. So 391 units, so that is our regional housing needs allocation target as a city. So all the city is mandated to do is provide that list to the state showing, these are the parcels that are zoned residential where private developers and nonprofits could come and propose and build those units. So our only responsibility is to zone for the units, and then developers, whether for-profit or nonprofit, actually would build the units. So we're not required to build the units, and if that number of units isn't generated, there could be some implications, but there's really not any strict penalties. It may affect our competitiveness for certain grants from the state, but there's no strict penalty for not meeting those housing targets currently.
Okay, so we have fulfilled some of that, correct?
So yeah, we are so far 150 units. About 150 units have been built since 2020.
Okay.
That includes ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and junior accessory dwelling units.
And do a lot of residents are building, I might get the acronym wrong, ADU? Yeah, ADU
Right.
units, do those count towards?
Yeah, I was just saying, so that 150, I don't have this exact statistic, but it wouldn't surprise me if more than half of those are ADUs.
Okay, and they're still coming right along. So,
Yeah, I was just looking at the latest report. So in 2024, we permitted, I think, 30, so about between 20 and 30 ADUs, so a lot.
And how many affordable units do we have on the books right now?
I don't have that number.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right, but we do have some things on the books.
there are, yes.
Okay, sorry. So we do have school district reps here, and I'm just wondering if they are willing to add to the presentation. And if they are able, if they can tell us if they've had a chance to read the letter that our mayor sent them regarding the public interest in acquiring the property, and if they would be willing to share if they have any thoughts for us on that.
So Mr. Pinkerton, I believe, is willing to answer questions tonight, but could we maybe first see if there's any more questions about kind of content of my presentation, planning and zoning before?
Thank you. I always wonder with these new housing requirements, do they take into consideration water availability? That's a lot of new units, and we already run short on water when we have drought seasons. Is that a consideration, or is that just ignored?
So there actually is, there is a requirement when we're doing our sites inventory with the housing element update. We do have to actually show that there is available water for those units. It's one of the new state requirements.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. You said something about 391 units are mandated?
Yeah, and I want to make sure no one leaves this meeting with the wrong understanding. So this has nothing to do with Morro Elementary, but just citywide, between 2020 and 2028, the city has to zone enough land residential for 391 units. So
Okay, by who's saying that?
that's the State Housing and Community Development Department. Yes.
Hi, Erin. I was wanting to know, is there any way that the city in any scenario would not be the lead agency?
Yeah, great question. So other public agencies do at times have the ability to assert lead agency status. Like right here and now, I wouldn't want to speculate about when that may or may not be possible, but I can say that it is possible for another state agency to actually be the lead agency under CEQA, and then they would have to come to the city still for a coastal development permit, and then the city would have to consider the other public agencies' environmental determination and see whether or not we agree with it. But the short answer is, there is the potential for another public agency to propose a project and claim that they are the lead agency.
And so in that case, they wouldn't, if we were to try to claim that building as historic, they would be able to determine that themselves. We wouldn't have that ability.
So we still have the general plan policies that require us to protect historic resources. Yeah, I think it would really kind of depend on, there's a potential for that. I think it would depend on the facts of that situation, but there's a potential where we'd have to have a discussion about that with the developer and other public agency and try to come to some shared understanding.
And then I just wanted to clarify that the school property is not included in the 391.
Exactly, yeah, so, right.
That would just be extra. That would be above and beyond what we are required to zone, right?
Right, so we had that vacant land survey showing there are enough vacant parcels zoned residential to meet the 391. In addition to that, there are some larger developed parcels such as Morro Elementary that could be redeveloped for housing.
And then the last question is, in that abstract land use picture, yeah, you showed the required open space of 22,600. Is that, I mean, beyond looking at these shapes, does that represent what is currently the sports fields or smaller than that? I don't know how that relates.
I think we determined that, and again, this is all very general, abstract. We looked at there's some requirements for private open space for the residential units, and there's a limit on lot coverage. So it was kind of a rough calculation just to give some type of order of magnitude of areas that would have to be provided as open space. It wouldn't necessarily be
like a park. It would be
sports fields or,
yeah,
a park.
Oh, okay. It's cumulative, like including their personal space. Okay.
I just feel that this is property that we all will regret if we do not get in control of keeping the open space. This is, you know, one of those paved paradise and put in a parking lot situations. And I hope that people here tonight appreciate the open space and the historic significance of everything related to that property, and that we can make a difference about what does go there in our city, because we need this open space. I think a lot of people are just complacent. We've driven by it. We've, you know, used that field, you know, and the school for so many years, but I think it is really significant to try to do something good with that property.
Well, thank you.
I probably sound a little bit illiterate, but I understand the property does belong to San Luis Coastal. Am I right?
Yes.
And we have to somehow, if we're going to do anything with it, we have to acquire it.
The school district currently owns the property. The city has land use authority, but is not the owner. So yeah, the city would.
So anything we say we're going to do with it, the person who is going to end up with the money in their pocket is going to be San Luis Coastal. Am I right?
I'm really just, you know, here to talk about the planning and zoning aspects. So I can't really answer.
Well, I'm just saying that some of this is just doesn't make sense, but I still think that we should maintain that as a park, and the school is definitely historical. You know, people stood at that school with shotguns when World War II broke out, and when that submarine came in, they were at every port and every place you could see water here, guarding us against that. These people are our history. We're standing on their shoulders, and we're talking about housing units and how much money we can make. Come on.
So the school was built in 1936,
Yes.
and Morro Bay wasn't a city. So
Right.
the land was bought by the county of San Luis Obispo. The school was built by the county of San Luis Obispo.
Yeah.
So the school was given to who? San Luis County or Morro Bay? And then in 1950s, when PG&E was built, our schools here became part of San Luis Coastal. But between those years, the 36 to when PG&E was built, but it was in Morro Bay, so it was donated to Morro Bay. Okay, I don't know if you see what I'm getting to. And I understand one reason San Luis Coastal pulled us in was because PG&E was built, the power plant, to get tax revenues.
So we're starting to stray a little bit from planning and zoning. If there are any more planning questions, I'm happy to do my best to answer them. If not, maybe we can, if there's questions for the district, I know they've offered to help answer. Mr. Pinkerton.
Yeah, Aaron, thank you. It was actually an excellent presentation. Nice to hear kind of what the city's plans were, and in terms of land use, those types of things. So my name is Ryan Pinkerton. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of San Luis Coastal of the Business Services. In terms of and I'm going to give a really short kind of just response to you kind of about in terms of where the district's at in the process part of it. I'm not going to get into the weeds tonight of why the district's selling the property, those types of things. But no, so I'll finish. So again, in terms of where we're at right now as a school district, so Morro Elementary, as Erin shared, was shut down in 2001. The school site itself, right, surplus property. It's been leased by different groups throughout that time period over the past 23 years. And so the site now, in its current state, it's really in need of a lot of work. And so if you've been around the site, if you've walked through it, there's a lot of work that needs to be done with that main schoolhouse to bring it back to what it should look like, right? In terms of keeping it, as well as the other buildings there on the campus itself. So for the school district's sake, we also have Del Mar Elementary School in Morro Bay. I think when I first started in my job 15 years ago, Morro Bay, Del Mar had about 525 students at the time. So we're currently down to a little over 200 at Del Mar Elementary School. So when we talk about the need for housing and families in the area, those types of things, those are things that do echo, I mean, from a school district standpoint, needs, right, in terms of, having kids and keeping that school, afloat, right, in this area. So it is important that we have families in the city. And, is that because of Airbnbs and other things like that? Probably in some ways, right? But having family homes, low affordable housing is key, I think. And again, we've been talking with the city for probably over 10 years about this property, right? And what could happen there and what we could do. And our school board's interest, of course, was to work out something with the city. That was kind of the goal, win-win, right, for the school district, for the city itself. But I understand the city's concerns. Like the property itself is expensive, and then the amount of money they have to put into that property, potentially, right, is another fiscal concern. And so, so all of that said, that's kind of where we're at. So for the school district, we'll never use that site as a school again in the foreseeable future, right, in terms of growth, those types of things. We have a ton of room at Del Mar Elementary School for more students. So there's a charter school that rents 2 classrooms on the site. So we're, again, for the district standpoint, we're not going to use that as a district school site. There are a couple programs that, again, we have a room at Del Mar Elementary School, even Morro Bay High School. So we'll keep our parent participation programs, other things that we have on that facilities at our other district sites. So all of that kind of led our district. We looked at some development ideas, things like that, maybe staff housing, other things, and I think the board decided, we're not developers. We're not developers, right? So I think that was part of the process now of, again, moving forward, again, asking the city first, of course. So this process that we go through now, as Erin talked about, we basically, we go through kind of 2 surplus processes. Those, each one, public agencies are notified. Each process takes 60 days, probably longer, honestly, by the time everything gets done. So the first is through HCD. The next will be through the State Board of Education. And so all of those are going to take longer than the 120 days that were asked by the citizens group. And yes, we did receive a letter from the mayor last night in that regards. And so, yeah, there's plenty of time to go through this process in terms of, and at that point, the nice thing about the State Board of Education process is it does allow the district some discretion at that point of who they sell the property to. So we do have discretion at that point, right, versus just a low bid situation. But again, those are things that are probably going to take over 120 days to kind of put in fold. So I know there's a citizen group that's looking to see if they can raise funds, those types of things. Great, fantastic, right? So we'll see how that all unfolds at the end of the process, and we'll keep the city updated so that they can share that information with the community as we go through. Of course, our school board meetings are also publicly held, information that you can find on the website, right? So it's all general information that, again, we can share with the public and share it throughout the process as we go through. But these 2 processes right now, we have to kind of put it out to public agencies and wait through those times, right? So it's not until after those processes are over where the school district can then decide what they're going to do in terms of proceeding with an RFQP or selling the property, those types of things. So it takes some time. Yeah.
Does the San Luis School District need the funds from selling this property?
So I'm not going to get too deep into kind of those types of questions, right? Our board would like to, of course, their facility funds, so the sale of Morro Elementary will have to be spent on real property. So it can't be spent on teacher salaries or other things like that, to keep programs, those types of things. The funds would have to go into a special account only for those types of purchases, just so you know. For any type, so fixing up schools, just has to go into property, maintenance schools, those types of things, right? Yes. So of course our board is gonna wanna try to maximize as much as they can, right, in terms of funds to support our students, our school district. We have a lot of, there's always needs that go into it. So I don't want to get too deep. It's already kind of the end of the meeting time. I could stay after and answer a couple questions that you might have, but probably time for me to hand the mic.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pinkerton. So we are just about at time. So Councilmember Landon, would you have a question? Go for it.
So you mentioned that if you have the revenue that you would get from the sale of the property can only be spent on facilities. Is that the case no matter how you receive the money? If you would use it in like if you did like a lease to own or something like that, would you be able to spend it on other things, or would you wouldn't be still limited? We watched your meeting in September where Lozano Smith was explaining your options, and I understood it to say that if you get a lease to own, that you use that for your general fund and stuff.
Just simply leasing the property?
No, like in a lease
That's
to
not
own.
the lease to own part of it. Yeah, we actually just responded to a public inquiry about that exact same thing. It still has to be used. The money has to be put towards real property.
Okay, or then if it's like, maybe he was saying 100-year lease or something like that.
Yeah, well, a lease is different than selling the property.
Right. Well, that's right, he was saying it would be advantageous because it would be. Right.
So I can answer some individual questions after if you want.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to go ahead and adjourn the meeting. So thank you all for being here. I guess the last thing I want to say is I'm very accessible. If you have more questions, my information is on the city's website. Give me a call. I'm happy to sit down and talk with any of you about land use for Morro L. So thank you very much.